Welcome to another episode of Real Atheology. For this episode, we interview Dr. Felipe Leon on the metaphysical possibility of creation ex nihilo, or creation out of nothing. This is an indispensable metaphysical doctrine to classical theists, but it has broader application to other areas of philosophy of religion as well. Dr. Felipe Leon is professor of philosophy at El Camino College in Torrance, California. He received his M.A. and his Ph.D. at University of California Riverside, and his current interests are in philosophy of religion and modal epistemology. Recently, Dr. Leon co-edited and contributed to a collection along with Bob Fischer entitled Modal Epistemology After Rationalism. Among other things, the collection indicates the recent trend in modal epistemology to seek the ground of our modal knowledge in empirical sources such as observation and observation-sensitive theory. Felipe also runs the Ex-Apologist Philosophy of Religion blog, which has a wealth of fantastic content that listeners to this podcast will no doubt enjoy. Without further delay, here is our interview with Dr. Felipe Leon. So Felipe, thank you so much for coming on Real Atheology.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
So the name of your blog, Ex-Apologist, suggests that you were not always so skeptical of religious claims. Could you perhaps talk a bit about why and how your religious or irreligious views have changed over time, and what, if any, role philosophy of religion played in that kind of transition?
Oh, sure. Yeah, definitely. I had a completely different view. So in my late teens, I converted to evangelical Christianity, and I sort of went in 100%. I was involved in missionary activity, evangelism, and so forth. And I was really passionate, and I would, do all sorts of weird things like read the Bible for 4 or 5 hours a day and study commentaries and pray in my closet on fast and engage in solitude and all that sort of stuff. And then through evangelism and missionary outreach, by the way, I was sure I was going to be a missionary to Russia for my whole life. Yeah. Through evangelism and missionary work, people ask hard questions. I'm like, well, that's a really good question. I'm going to have to go research that. And the more I looked, the more I had to engage in Christian apologetics. And so I just read vociferously, and I had questions of my own. And, pretty soon you get to a level of apologetics where you're like, wow, to really understand and evaluate these arguments, I'm going to have to do go back to college. So I I did my undergraduate and master's and my PhD, but about halfway through graduate school, I lost my faith. I sort of had internalized all of these arguments from all the way down to, what's his name, Josh McDowell's More Than a Carpenter to, Alvin Plantinga and Richard Swinburne.
Sure.
And knew these arguments inside and out, and would share my faith with them. And then, but halfway through grad school, you realize you've got enough logical machinery to really evaluate these arguments. And it always seemed that there was some questionable premise, or where the argument's going to hang on some doubtful assumption. And so all my deductive arguments sort of came crashing to the ground. And then looking at the probabilistic arguments didn't fare any better. It seemed to me just to be a wash at the very best. And then especially, I don't know if this is relevant to our discussion, but there was always this nagging worry, just reading the New Testament from the Gospels through Paul's letters through Revelation, is this thread, this unified thread of a message of a conviction that Jesus was going to come back within, a generation or so.
Right.
In some literal sense with divine judgment. And this, of course, didn't pan out in any clear way. And, we're 20 centuries or so later, and so this really started nagging me at this point, where all these arguments fell apart, and or at least didn't seem satisfying. And so I went back and researched. I read the historical apologetics literature as well, and I looked at the historical Jesus stuff that apologists themselves would recommend, that were, not evangelical Christians. And then the clear message again was, yeah, Felipe, you're right. It's pretty clear that Jesus thought he was an apocalyptic prophet of an imminent end of the age and judgment, but he was just wrong.
Right,
so,
right.
I remember I was in the library at the university just finishing up reading this, and right around Christmas break, after finishing grading my philosophy classes, and my faith just left me.
Oh, wow.
So that's where they went, which was really sad. At the same time, though, it was sort of like going through a painful divorce or something, but it's also very liberating. So in a number of ways, it didn't feel like Dad was always. I always had to get the okay from Dad to live my life and shape it in the way I see fit, which is kind of a bummer. And issues about tolerance and issues about compatibility of science and Christianity just all fell away, and that was a big relief as well. So that's basically what happened, and then that led to me sort of blogging on Ex-Apologist and just talking about these arguments, and that's the origin of where I'm at now and where the blog came from.
Fantastic. Your blog, I think, has been a great resource for a lot of people looking into these questions, and so I think I speak for a lot of people when I say I very much appreciate what you've done there. Now, I wanted to speak with you about some of the arguments that you've kind of advocated against classical theism that play on the essential theistic doctrine of creation ex nihilo, or creation out of nothing. And one of your arguments has as its first premise the claim that all concrete objects that have an originating or sustaining cause have a material cause of their existence. You call this the principle of material causality. And there are several terms here and concepts that I think listeners may or may not be familiar with. And so for those less familiar with the terminology at use here, could you unpack what this first premise means with regard to these phrases: concrete objects, material cause, originating cause, and sustaining cause? So could you talk a bit about what that first premise is actually saying?
Sure. So I should just start off with just a really intuitive sense of the argument. The argument of which this is a part is just basically saying creating things out of nothing is impossible in the strongest possible sense. But if classical theism is true, then God created the universe out of nothing, and therefore classical theism is false. And so that's the basic idea. And the key premise is this causal premise, which I call the principle of material causality, which basically says, very roughly, and there's going to need to be qualifications, but basically, you can't to get new stuff, you have to have old stuff. New stuff comes from old stuff. Basically, that's the roughest idea. But right, the idea is that all concrete objects are aggregates of such that have an originating or sustaining cause, have an originating or sustaining material cause, respectively. And the idea of a concrete object, which plays a crucial role, is the notion basically of substance. Philosophically, the notion of substance has always played a central role, all the way back to Aristotle. But the notion of a substance is just basically a thing or an object, something that can undergo change and remain the same. It can gain and lose properties. It can exist in its own right. It's the bearer of properties and so forth. So, for example, an apple would be a substance or a concrete object, and it has parts. It has a skin and a core and so forth, and it can undergo change and still remain the same apple. And it has these properties, being red, being round, and so forth. And so it's basically just a concrete object in the sense of a substance that bears properties and can exist in its own right and undergo change. I mean, I don't want to pin too much on any particular notion of a substance, but
sure.
Those are, I think we all have a facility with the concept to be able to use it competently in ordinary discourse, but that's the basic idea. And so, there are other concrete objects. There are, events like sliding into home base, but it doesn't seem to be an object, or, surfaces of objects. The one-dimensional surface on top of a table seems to be an object, but seems to depend on, the whole table, and so forth. Tropes are instances of properties, like the particular instance of red in an apple would be a trope. It's a concrete object too. But the kind of concrete object I have in mind is the substance. So that's what I mean by a concrete object. And I'm saying those sorts of things need material causes if they come to be or have a sustaining cause. Mm-hmm. What about the other notions? By originating cause, I mean the temporal beginning of a thing's existence. So, for example, if you have a shiny new penny, and it just came, it just got punched out of a sheet of copper on the press. That was its originating cause, right? The stamper of that copper.
Right.
So it's the efficient cause of its temporal beginning. And so, the atoms that make up a water molecule come together in chemical bonds. In that moment, whatever brought those elements to be was its originating cause. And by sustaining cause, I mean the cause of a thing's continued existence. So, for example, the oxygen that surrounds a flame is at least a partial sustaining cause of its existence. It keeps it in existence. So that's the basic idea. There's a couple confusions that I should clarify with the premise.
Sure.
Sometimes people think that when I say material cause, I just mean physical stuff. And I certainly, that is one kind of substance, but I don't want to beg any questions. And so I allow there are other kinds of concrete objects like immaterial substances. God on theism is a substance or a concrete object. He's just an immaterial one. Or angels or human souls would be concrete objects. So that's one clarification. Another one is that sometimes people say, well, if you're saying that all concrete objects that have an originating or sustaining efficient cause have an originating or sustaining material cause, does that mean the universe had to have a beginning? And the answer is no. If the universe never had an originating efficient cause, then it doesn't need an originating material cause. So the universe could be past eternal. If it has and especially if it doesn't have a sustaining efficient cause, it doesn't need a sustaining material cause. If the universe is a finite, four-dimensional block universe with a beginning point but no efficient cause, no problem. It just says things with efficient causes need material causes, and since it didn't have one, no problem. So those are some clarifications about it, about the premise.
So by material cause, I'm assuming you're meaning to capture a kind of Aristotelian notion of material cause, that which the new thing is made up of.
Mm-hmm. It's roughly that. Sometimes people say that material cause in Aristotle's sense and Aquinas' sense is the stuff of which something is made. And I don't necessarily mean that. I mean the stuff from which it was made. So, someone could say, the material cause of a vase is the plaster or ceramic material of which it's made. Yeah, in Aristotle's sense, but I mean the stuff from which that stuff was made. So, it's still... Yeah.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about concrete objects, and you mentioned tropes earlier. So is that a nominalist approach? Where do abstract objects kind of fit in this concept of substance, or do they even fit into it?
Oh, I want to remain neutral on that, and I want the argument to remain neutral on that. You could be a nominalist, you could be a Platonist, You could be an Aristotelian about universals. I don't want to make any commitments. But if somebody if somebody's committed to tropes as some ontological category of entities, collections of particular red things, red instances in a bunch of apples, that's fine. But I don't want to commit. But it's just I use those examples as ways of individuating concrete object from these other ontological categories.
So now that we have a kind of better understanding of premise one, what reasons do we have for thinking that it's actually true?
Good question. So I want to say, in the broadest of terms, exactly the same grounds that we have for the key causal premise of any, say, cosmological argument. So basically, universal experience is one. And so from universal experience, we always see when something originates or is sustained, there's a material cause. Copper pennies come from sheets of copper. Water molecules come from more basic particles. Flames come from reacting gases and solids, and on without exception. And so you can run, say an enumerative induction argument, this huge quantity of every single entity we've observed that's a concrete object that begins or is sustained has material cause. So probably all of them whatsoever do. But I think a safer way to do it is just to say it's an inference to the best explanation. The simplest hypothesis with the widest scope and fit and conservatism, if you want to say that fit and conservatism are different, is just that, the reason why we observe this is because it's just a general causal principle that things with originating or sustaining efficient causes have originating and sustaining material causes. So one is experience, and from that you could generate inductive and abductive arguments. Another basis is just rational intuition. Once you just understand it and think about it hard enough, you can just see that it's true. You can take a more modest approach and just say, well, it certainly seems to be true. I don't know if rational intuition is real, but I have these seemings, and when I reflect, it certainly seems to be true. To generate this sort of these seemings or intuitions, you can just think about thought experiments. So, for example, and here I'm cribbing from Wes Morriston, who really got me thinking hard about material causes.
And who's a previous guest on the show.
Yeah, all right. Great guy, and great that you had him on there. He talks about a lumberjack. Suppose you meet a lumberjack in a forest, and they say, hey, look at my log cabin. I just made it out of nothing. And you reflect on what that could mean, usually you have trees from which you make the wood, and nails and other materials to make a log cabin, some kind of cementing material as well, and say, no, I didn't use any of that, well, what do you make it out of? Did you use the surrounding atmosphere and turn it into logs and so forth, like a genie? No, I didn't do that either. So there's nothing external to me from which I transform.
Right.
Narrative, and there's nothing internal to me either. There's no reservoir of energy that somehow came out of me by an act of will and transformed into that. So nothing internal to me or external to me was the material from which I made it. I just said, let there be a log cabin where there wasn't one. So the basic idea is it's like it seems to be rationally repugnant. It's like trying to regurgitate a mixed lunch by a dry heave. If there's nothing in there, nothing is coming out. So you can, even if you have all power, no matter how hard you heave, nothing is going to come out. Right, because there's nothing in there to come out.
Right.
That's a trick. I mean, we just have this intuition, and it seems to be the same kind of intuition that we have, or similar intuition we have when we say, you couldn't just get a tiger popping into existence out of nothing without any cause at all, whether efficient or material or whatever, right? It just couldn't be. There's some kind of rational repugnance to both ideas. Now, you could resist it. And in fact, I don't really care if anyone resists it, because the problem is just as bad if you reject the principle. Mm-hmm. You could just say, well, David Hume taught us that whatever you could imagine or conceive without contradiction is possible, is metaphysically possible, right? And so I can imagine, somebody saying, let there be a log cabin where there wasn't one, presto. And that's enough for me, or at least to say that that's possible, a creation ex nihilo of log cabins.
Right, so the conceivability is serving as a kind of modal evidence for the possibility of this.
Exactly, and this really liberal, freewheeling kind of conceivability. Like, well, when I reflect, I don't see a contradiction, and that's enough. Basically, it's not a contradiction to suppose otherwise. Mm-hmm. And you're like, yeah, that's true. The same thing goes with imagining or conceiving or intuiting a universe popping into existence out of nothing without a cause, right? No contradiction there either. So it looks like both are in the same boat, right? If you accept things can't pop into existence without any cause, then because of universal experience and rational intuition or seeming, then by the same token, you got to accept or reject the other. They seem to stand or fall together. So sure, you can reject the principle of material causality, but then to be consistent, it looks like you're going to have to reject the principle of causality full stop. In which case that puts theism in a load of trouble, because then that means there's a possible world where a universe pops into existence without God.
Right.
And on classical theism, God is the creator and sustainer of all concrete worlds that exist. So you get another refutation of theism by denying it.
Yeah, that's a pretty severe dilemma. So I imagine that someone might just say, oh, none of this is a problem because God is omnipotent, right? So problem solved. Yeah, it's bizarre, and it's this rational intuition. It seems to point against it, but we're talking about divine beings, and our cognitive faculties are not much use with respect to considering the capabilities of a divine being. So, would appealing to just brute omnipotence, to the definition of God, would that get the theist anywhere with respect to this argument?
Not without a lot more to say, because on the face of it, it's just saying, well, God's omnipotent. Being omnipotent entails doing anything can do anything that's metaphysically possible. Therefore, God could create the universe ex nihilo. But the problem is there's a missing premise, and that is creating a universe ex nihilo is metaphysically possible. Right. And I just gave two arguments to say there aren't. So there's burden-shifting grounds to explain why it is possible. So a bare appeal to omnipotence isn't going to cut it. In a way, some people, I've delivered this paper a couple of times, and sometimes, talking to people after, I say, look, in effect, you can take it as an argument that is just saying, well, if theism is true, well, we just learned a new fact about omnipotence. Omnipotence doesn't include the possibility of creating things out of nothing. Mm-hmm. And we've done similar things with omniscience. We thought, God can know anything. Well, he doesn't know what it's like not to know. He doesn't know what it's like firsthand to sin. So there's plenty of things an all-knowing being can't know. And maybe this is, could be God's omnipotent, and just he could do anything possible, and creating things ex nihilo is just not a possible thing.
So one of the other responses that you kind of consider in your writings in response to this argument is to point out that, with regard to developments in quantum cosmology, there have been at least some science popularizers, and I'm thinking of like Lawrence Krauss in his book A Universe from Nothing, wherein they argue that that actually things do pop into existence out of nothing occasionally. And so it seems that there's at least some kind of scientific ground to endorsing a kind of creation ex nihilo. Obviously you'd need to attach a person to do the creating out of nothing, but it doesn't seem like that far of a stretch. Is this what kind of weight would a response like this have?
These are interesting things that theoretical physicists have said, like Lawrence Krauss and Alexander Vilenkin. They say things that the universe arose from a random fluctuation in a quantum vacuum. Yeah, right. Maybe it did, but a quantum vacuum counts as a concrete object.
Right.
Is something exists in its own right and bears properties and can undergo change. So it would just be a universe from something. Vilenkin says on his account, we have a universe that shrinks down to a zero radius particle, tunnels through an energy barrier, and then expands into a universe. Wow, that's a pretty remarkable particle. Mm-hmm. We can modify over, and it exists in its own right and bears properties and undergoes change. It sounds like a concrete object, just a zero-dimensional concrete object. I mean, I'm granting that souls can be zero-dimensional concrete objects. So that doesn't seem to be a case of something from nothing. But I should say two other things about that. So first of all, it doesn't look like there are counterexamples without further evidence. But even more importantly, this wouldn't help the theist. This would just say, things can pop into existence out of nothing without a cause after all. So much the worse for theism. Right. There's possible where you get a universe without God. So certainly nothing that a theist would want to cling to. But perhaps more controversially, at least in strictly speaking, my argument is compatible with universes from nothing. It just says you can't have a universe from nothing without an efficient cause.
Right.
So all bets are off. It's even compatible. It's a very ecumenical principle. Self don't think that could happen. No doubt. Who knows? Maybe science will show that's wrong, although I don't know how that could be. I mean, how could you give a set of laws that govern a prior state to a next state that generate a universe when there is no prior state? But anyway, but who knows? But in any case, it looks like it wouldn't be of help to the theist.
Right. So this general principle of material causality that we've been discussing, do you think this has any further significance within different debates in philosophy of religion? Do you think what other debates can it contribute to in this way?
I think it can contribute in another way to philosophy of religion and to metaphysics proper. It all in one shot to both goals. Because I think if you accept the principle and if it's justified, then we have the basis for answering one of the most fundamental questions, and that is, why is there something rather than nothing? And it looks like we can go back to Epicurus. Right? We don't really have his writings. We have writings about him from Lucretius, but Lucretius gives a nice formulation of an argument for why there's something rather than nothing. And basically, you can't get something for nothing. And so since matter is here, matter must have always been here. In which case we have reason to think that it's at least some kind of necessary being, maybe quote unquote factually necessary, right? It's a eternal, uncaused, freestanding, independent being, this material universe or whatever it is. You could strengthen the argument by using Kripke's doctrine of origin essentialism, that things have their origins of necessity, right? I wouldn't be me if it wasn't that particular sperm egg pair that led to me. If it was a different one, it wouldn't be Felipe. So the idea is, if things have their origin essentially, and the universe is essentially wasn't in fact caused, then it's essentially uncaused. In which case you have reason to think the universe is essentially uncreated. And then if you accept some kind of principle of sufficient reason, you might think, well, whatever plays the role of being eternal and essentially uncreated doesn't vary from possible world to possible world, then you have a grounds for thinking the universe is a metaphysically necessary being.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could answer the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Because the universe can't not exist. It's a necessary being.
I wanted to kind of play devil's advocate and throw a objection out there, or a possibility that would a theist maybe have, of an idealist persuasion, have some sort of out just by denying the material world altogether and saying that, well, there's these material causes, but they're the mind of God. Is that an objection that maybe you've considered? Or
Yeah, great question. I mean, there are all sorts of concessive responses, and I've tried to address these elsewhere, but the idea is you can sort of deny the universe as a concrete object and say, it's an idea in the mind of God, and then you can become like a Berkeleyan idealist. And that's a way out. Another way out is to say the universe is a mode or aspect of God, and you could become like a Spinozistic monist. Or you could say the universe is made out of God or is God, in which case you are a panentheist or pantheist, respectively. Or you could say, so you could take these roles, you just wouldn't be a classical theist anymore. And the worry is, there are people that defend idealism, but they're pretty, there are few takers. And the worry is people who would accept a Berkeleyan argument for God it's probably going to be a tiny school of subset of philosophers.
It certainly is, but I've seen it. So Inspiring Philosophy, the YouTuber I know, has kind of jumped on that idealist bandwagon.
Yeah.
Because they see the hard problem of consciousness as just intractable.
Yeah, I tend to agree with them. By the way, I tend to be a Russellian monist, like David Chalmers and others. I mean, I don't really know, but I'm kind of agnostic about that. But I tend to think that's right. You'd have to look at all the data across the board to figure something out like that. But that would certainly be a long road to hoe, a tough road to hoe to make the case.
Yeah, you have to establish idealism. That's a task in and of itself.
Yeah. So it really shows the force of the argument, I think, is how much you're willing. Yeah, it's pretty costly, right? How much you're willing to throw out to preserve some kind of supernaturalism. You might be stuck with something you really don't want, something very unorthodox, which I'm fine with. I tend to think, I shouldn't say, but I tend to think that the people who really are interested in these arguments, and not all of them, there's plenty of people who aren't, but tend to be people in the grand old party, and people in that party. Not that I have a vendetta against that. I'm just saying that the people that tend to accept these kinds of arguments are people that aren't going to want to go liberal in those ways and become, Berkeleyan idealists or panentheists or Spinozists and so forth, which is fine, right? Well, I guess it's neither here nor there, but it would be an interesting result in philosophy of religion if we've made progress, right? We can at least rule out one candidate worldview and start looking at, say, panentheistic and Spinozistic accounts of the divine.
Yeah, that would be very interesting. But yeah, no, I think you're right in that people who are interested in these arguments are going to see that as a radical theological shift, and so they're far more likely to, attempt an objection to, say, premise one, and it's not at all clear that there are any decent objections to the first premise there.
Yeah, and like I said, even if there are, then so much the worse for theism, because then you get possible worlds with with universes without God. But also, I think the most interesting thing to say or perhaps the most interesting thing a theist can say with the least amount of concession is to say, well, maybe the universe was made from some sort of reservoir of energy internal to God. I think, when I ask my students that in philosophy of religion classes, they tend to think that's what creation ex nihilo is, because I think they implicitly accept the premise. And so that's an interesting view, but then, you can kiss the cosmological argument goodbye, because then that means this reservoir of energy is eternal and uncaused.
Right.
And, which is something that the non-theist has said about the universe. We have an eternal, uncaused universe, which is either a brute fact or metaphysically or factually necessary, which would just be the ultimate cosmological argument killer. I mean, they could say, well, the reservoir came from nothing, but then you have the argument all over again, where, how could that be?
Right. So what's kind of interesting here is, this is a bit of a side tangent here, but so far as I know, at least with respect to Genesis 1, Hebrew scholars actually say that what's being described there is that that there's a kind of formless void, a pre-existing formless void on which God acts to create the world, as in he creates, there is a material cause to the world, right? There is a log to the log cabin, essentially, that out of which God is creating the universe.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm no Old Testament exegete or expert in that, but I think, a clear reading of it seems to indicate that, that the universe was created from prior stuff. Basically, God is like a demiurge that sort of fashioned pre-existing primordial matter, which is probably factually or metaphysically necessary. And then, it's an interesting view. The worry is, right? If you accept that, then you're probably going to have to reject a lot of apologetics, because then, it seems
I didn't know any of this. What y'all are saying right now, I didn't know.
Yeah, it's rightly so. It's understandable that people don't hear that, because I think that philosophers of religion in the theist camp, they might not realize it, but I think implicitly they understand that unless they accept the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, not only do you lose some of the preeminence and providence of God and the ultimate dependence of creation on creator, but you no longer are able to individuate theism from other views like panentheism and pantheism and idealism and Spinoza's and demiurgism. So they need it. They need creation ex nihilo to give arguments that would individuate it from other views. But on the other hand, right, it looks to be metaphysically impossible. So they're stuck with this dilemma. It's a doctrine they need to rationally support and individuate theism, but the thing that they need is in itself metaphysically impossible.
Very interesting. So Felipe, what are some of your other current research projects? I know you've just finished a collection on which you've contributed on modal epistemology. What other stuff have you got in the works?
So right now I'm working on a book with Joshua Rasmussen at Azusa Pacific University, who's a really good philosopher, and he has what I think are the best versions of Leibniz's or Leibnizian cosmological arguments. And we're working on a book project on theism for and against, and very friendly. The goal is just to have this very friendly, collegial, cooperative approach. A book sort of in the spirit of the book you just did with Randall Rounser, is that correct?
Yeah.
So hopefully it'll have that kind of similar spirit if we're lucky, and I think we will. He's a friend of mine and a good guy. And so we're basically, he gives his Leibnizian argument, and I give the kinds of arguments and considerations I just gave. Mm-hmm. And of course, we'll talk about the problem of evil and stuff like that. But my main thing, in addition to that, is just trying to apply stuff from a dissertation and from this book to issues in philosophy of religion. So the thrust of that book that Bob Fischer and I just completed editing is just to say that our knowledge of possibility is grounded in our knowledge of the actual world through deductive and inductive and abductive inference. I know this table can be moved around because I've seen actual tables like this moved around, mm-hmm. And so forth. And so, there's a growing number of modal epistemologists who are becoming empiricists in this way. Timothy Williamson is arguably going in the leading modal epistemologist is going in this direction in his book, The Philosophy of Philosophy, and a number of other philosophers. Bob just put out a book called Modal Justification by Theories, which gives an empiricist account of modal knowledge by way of inference to the best explanation from actual theories. And my view is kind of pluralist, that we know what's possible through deduction, induction, and abduction, and observation-sensitive theory. But if these accounts are correct and that exhausts our modal knowledge, then we're not going to have knowledge probably of far-out possibilities remote from ordinary experience. And so right. I'm thinking about this implication, and I want to write a book about natural theology and modal epistemology, and that since just about every argument for theism depends on a crucial possibility premise, and that's usually remote from ordinary experience, all of them are going to fail. So,
oh, wow. So just for primarily epistemic reasons, we don't have access to those distant modal worlds then?
Yeah. So think of Alvin Plantinga's modal ontological argument. One of the key premise is just that it's possible. There's a possible world where there's a metaphysically necessarily being, God. And once you accept that in S5, axiom S5 of S5 modal logic, you're pretty much stuck with theism. Whatever's possibly necessary is necessary simplicator, so it's a necessary being. So, but the problem is, the claim that it's possible there's an Anselmian being is far out from ordinary experience. It's not like, if I were to cross the street right now, I wouldn't get hit by a Mack truck, or that lime on my counter could be sliced in half, or, the kinds of humdrum modal claims that we need to survive and reproduce. So, crucially to defend the cosmological argument, or at least Leibniz's, the universe is a dependent being or contingent being, and that's going to depend on largely modal evidence of, well, you can imagine a universe coming to be out of nothing, right? Or, there's this famous subtraction argument. Just take the universe and subtract an atom. Is that possible? Yeah. What about 2? Yeah. You can get down to the last atom and subtract it. Is that possible? Yeah. So it's possible for there to be no universe. So it's dependent. But the worry is, wait a minute. Sure, I can imagine there being fewer cats and cars, but I can't, when cats and cars are annihilated, it's not like the matter that makes them up is annihilated.
Right.
So we don't have evidence that it's possible for parcels of matter or energy to be annihilated. Just the things made out of matter energy. So it looks like the best modal evidence we have in the subtraction argument doesn't get off the ground. And, maybe the argument from religious experience survives, but and maybe some versions of the design argument, but a lot is going to have to go.
That sounds like that's got a really broad implications to it. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and the arguments for dualism too, some of them. But yeah, I think so too. It's like I'm a big admirer of Hume. I think he's one of the greatest philosophers. Maybe I'm partial. We share a birthday, but he
that's awesome.
He's very skeptical about our knowledge of the actual world, but he was very, very liberal in his knowledge. What he thought we had knowledge of possible worlds. As long as it's contradiction free, it's possible. And so it's basically just taking Hume one step further in his empiricism. Even our modal knowledge has to be grounded in experience. in which case, our knowledge of possibility is going to be pretty humdrum. I know I'm working on a bunch of papers. I just have been short on time the last year or so, but I have a bunch of stuff in the works. There's one paper on the design argument that a point I don't think hasn't been pushed is, Hume kind of got close to it in the dialogues by, with the who designed the designer objection. But I think that the objection that objection can go deeper, right? The deeper point seems to be that if God is kind of like a watch without a watchmaker, then we're saying that theism is committed to the view that there is teleology at the metaphysical ground floor that God can't create. But if that's true, on theism you would expect there to be teleology without design. Whether so there's right at the foundation of the theistic worldview is an uncaused watch, and the worry is that so theism predicts that there'll be uncaused foundational teleology, and the worry is, isn't that
teleology is making a comeback?
Yeah, that's right. It is.
Thomas Nagel and Alistair McIntyre with virtue ethics. I've seen a lot of themes of teleology.
Yeah,
floating
and
around.
Biology too. It's coming back. There's an epistemologist, Peter Graham, at UC Riverside, who has sort of a naturalistic version of proper functionalism in epistemology, where through evolutionary selection pressures, our cognitive faculties have been designed, and so one cause of design is intelligence, but another one is selective pressures of evolution acting on critters with scarce resources, and whatever features allow them to survive and reproduce in their natural habitat under normal conditions counts as their purpose or design.
The aim to which they tend.
Yeah, exactly. So it's teleology is perfectly at home in a naturalistic universe. Maybe design isn't fundamental on this view, but it looks like there's nothing wrong with unconscious teleology. It looks like theism is committed to it. But if so, then isn't that going to kill, say, the fine-tuning design argument? Theism predicts, fine-tune things without causes. So would a fine-tuned universe really be surprising on theism, whether or not God designed anything?
Right. It would be prior to, it'd be, I guess, conceptually prior to God.
Yeah, and maybe even ontologically prior. It may just teleology just floating around out there. Anyway.
Yeah, very interesting.
I would, I guess, to kind of wrap things up, I've been a big fan of your work, Felipe, for quite a while now, and you have a debate with Dr. Rhoda.
He's a great guy.
It's probably one of my favorite debates that I've ever seen, and it costs like $2 to rent it, and I've rented it probably 4 times.
Oh wow!
Because I just kept watching. Because I kept
By the way,
getting
I'd have to buy it now if I was going to watch it.
It's something I certainly recommend to people. It's $2, but it's well worth it. I think the title of it was "Are Theistic Beliefs Reasonable?" or "Are Christian Beliefs Reasonable?" I can't remember the title off the top of my head.
To tell you the truth, I can't remember. It's something like that. Yeah,
I'm pretty sure it's "Are Christian Beliefs Reasonable?" I could be mistaken. We'll correct that if it's wrong.
I bet if you just put in, Felipe Leon, Michael Rhoda debate, it might come up. Or
it's a super refreshing debate too, because I feel like there's no animosity or sense of one of you trying to defeat the other, and y'all both just present some just really interesting arguments. I mean, from start to finish, it was. You had one of it was about appealing to aesthetic properties.
Oh, right.
And I watched that part probably 5 or 6 times, just going, wow, this is such a neat thing to think about. It's like, what if we do have a realism about aesthetic values? What kind of implications does it have for theism? And I just hadn't thought of that.
Wow, yeah, I know. What's weird is before I was a Christian or anything, when I was a little kid, I was, looking at books on, flora and fauna, and I was just shocked over and over of how ugly and revolting much of the natural world was.
Some of your examples were just great, by the way.
Yeah, what's that? The Symathoa exigua, that critter that latches onto a fish's tongue and sucks it dry until it falls off and it becomes the tongue.
Yeah.
I know. It's horrific. And now, thanks to the wonders of the internet, I just started Googling around like the world's most revolting creatures, and you could just go to Netflix and watch, these nature shows, and usually it's so funny. It's like the unstated premise is, look how revolting the world is, but they're trying to say how amazing it is. But the way in which animals just prey on each other and is just revolting. I don't know. When I was a kid, I just thought this just can't be a benevolent world, Yeah. By the way, that's another argument I'm working on. Not just that the universe is revolting, but it looks like it has evil design baked into it. Like the design plan of many organisms is just to cause other organisms misery. What is it? A certain kind of wasp will inject a sperm and an egg into, say, a worm, and it fertilizes in there, and then it burrows out of the chest of the, centipede, caterpillar or whatever it is, basically just like the movie Alien. It's just the most revolting thing, and just for nature to be set up, designed to cause, sort of revolting and horrific suffering, just, seems to point to the opposite conclusion. if there's some kind of deity.
Certainly seems to be a tension there.
Yeah, or the margay cat that mimics the cry of baby chimps, so that the parent chimps will go look for them and then they'll go eat the parents.
Well, that's just clever.
Nice, well played. So often we just get stuck with a few arguments against theism, and I'm like, there's so many more out there.
If you appreciate the content and the tone of what Real A Theology has to offer, please consider writing a review of the show on iTunes or contributing a modest amount per episode to the Real A Theology Patreon. The Real A Theology intro music is by Thomas Smith, with all other music by Jason Camo, The Lost State of Mind. We would like to thank our patrons: Matt Smith, Lucas Stewart, Matt Yellen, Richard Kane, John Danaher of the Philosophical Disquisitions blog, Kim Bushkovsky, Andrew Snyder, Jason Mecoleta, Evan Wirtz, Bob April, and Alexander Soames.